Hello, everyone. Welcome to our monthly live Move Smartly market update for the month of November. Thank you again. This is our second time host. Everyone, welcome to our monthly live Move Smartly market update for the month of We're having November. A technical issue. There we go. That's better. I had my audio on in the live stream in the background. All right. So let's kick things off again. Again, market update for November for Move Smartly. Thank you all again for joining. I'm just going to kind of go over our agenda for this month. Let's pull it up here. As I go through my technical issues, here we go. Here's our report. All right, so this month we're going to be chatting a little bit about the market update for low-rise homes, market update for condominiums. I'm going to chat a little bit about some of the on-the-ground trends we're seeing, in particular, so the low sales and the low volume of listings on the market that's keeping prices pretty stable. Chat a little bit about some of the red flags in Toronto's pre-construction condo market. Talk about the federal government's latest immigration numbers and announcement and how the boom is likely going to help support house prices. At least that looks like it's part of the plan. And then we're going to finish off by talking about the sentiment or the mood in the market. And I think this is something that a lot of people, at least when I tweet about it, I mean, what we write about this month is I've kind of mentioned that the sentiment has improved a little bit this fall compared to the spring. And I think a lot of people don't understand what that means. And they think that just because sales are down, everyone is panicking. So I want to unpack some of the big changes, because some of the big changes in prices we've seen since COVID were just these massive shifts in sentiment. I'm going to try to unpack that today as we go through the update. As always, if you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. Urmi from Move Smartly is with us live. She's going to be kind of raising some of your questions. Davin from our sales team will also be active in the chat. If you have any personal questions and specific questions, please, you can basically set up a consult with me directly at movesmartly.com/meetjohn. Again, this is for questions that are a little bit more specific or personal. I've been getting a few more of these over the past months, especially with some of the big changes we're seeing in the market. So I'm just going to chat a little bit about some of the trends we're seeing for houses and for condos separately. When we look at sort of the volume for house volume and sales for houses, for low-rise homes, I should say, they're down 47% over last year, and we're at a 20-year low, just over 3,000 homes sold for the month of October, which is a 20-year low. New listings were down over last year. They were also at a 20-year low. And when we look at the active listings, this statistically looks alarming, because there are, new listings are nearly double what they were, or active listings are nearly double what they were last year. But they were so low last year because, again, the market was so heated and competitive. At the end of the day, active listings volumes are still historically quite low. And I'm going to kind of compare those, and I'm going to look at that in an upcoming section of the report. When we look at the months of inventory, and months of inventory, again, is an important metric because it kind of compares supply and demand in one metric. So if there are 100 homes for sale at the end of the month and 50 homes sold that month, we have 2 months of inventory. And that's actually roughly what we have in the low-rise market. We have 2.3 months of inventory. It's been pretty flat since the last month, hasn't changed. And prices have not changed since pretty much July. I mean, low-rise home prices have been bouncing around 1.3 million, still well below the peak of 1.7 in February. And now we're getting into this period where prices are actually starting to be down year over year. So prices were actually down 9% over last year for the month of October. Looking at the condo market, very similar dynamics. So I don't want to kind of dwell on it too much. Sales are down 53%, 20-year lows. New listings are down over last year. They're also quite low. Active listings are up over last year, but again, also quite low for condominiums. And condominiums are also seeing relatively stable months of inventory. They're at about 3 months. And also condo prices are also have been relatively stable over the past few months since July. Condo prices are actually up a little bit, around 1% over last year. Now, just a little bit about sort of some of the things we're seeing on the ground. It's a very odd, I'd say, an interesting market. I mean, the homes that are the nicest that come on the market every week are attracting a ton of buyers. I mean, people think it's crazy, but there are still multiple offers, homes getting 10, 20 offers. And again, I don't want to, this is not the norm. These are the nicest homes that hit the market every week. Everything else is just sitting on the market for sale. It's taking time to move. It could be on the market for weeks or months. And part of the reason we're seeing this dynamic, at least from my perspective, is that there are buyers out there. There aren't a ton of new listings sitting in the market. Everyone's rushing to the nicest, and buyers aren't feeling panicked that they need to, rush to buy one of these other homes that maybe isn't as renovated, not as in great condition. And these other homes that are sitting on the market, a lot of times, in some cases, they're overpriced, and that's why they're sitting. In other cases, they're just, average homes that were renovated 10 years ago, not last year in the past 2 years that are, move-in and brand new. So a little bit more dated, a little older. And some buyers just feel like they can be a little bit patient, when it comes to waiting out sort of the market and seeing what new listings come up on the market, if not now, in the spring. And I think that's really what's kind of motivating a lot of buyers to just not rush and be patient for some of the right homes. And when we think about the balance we've seen in the market in terms of prices I touched on since July, a lot of that is, again, due to the fact that there are very, very few homes for sale. When we look kind of back over the past 22 years since 2000, the last time we saw homes like this few listings on the market for the month of October were actually relatively recent. So it was in 2021 and in 2016. But in both of those years, we're sort of at the peak of these housing bubbles where basically anything that was listed for sale was basically being purchased, and the demand significantly exceeded the number of homes available for sale. So that's why inventory was actually quite low. So if we sort of skip over these bubble years of 2016 and 2021, the last time we had this few listings on the market for sale was back in 2001. And when we think about, the last time sales were roughly this month's volume, this month's volume for October was actually very similar to October 2008 during the financial crisis. It wasn't that different. But the difference is there were twice as many homes for sale back then as there are today. And this is really one of the key factors that has led to some stability in prices, that we're not seeing a ton of new listings and just not a lot of active inventory on the market. So that's a little bit about, and again, a lot of this is regional, of course. Certain pockets are a little bit busier than others. Downtown's a little bit busier. Markham, Richmond Hill are pretty busy. Some of the markets outside of the GTA are, of course, quite a bit slower, especially the further out you are. I don't know if we have any questions specifically, Urmi, before we kind of jump into the condo market section.
Yes, some questions here about whether we can drill into some of these numbers a bit.
Yeah.
So I think you may have mentioned this, but what are the year-over-year dates for, prices for condos and houses? A lot of the media and even ourselves at Moose Nightly, we're talking about from the peak.
Yeah.
So
that's a good question. So the reason we've been talking about from the peak for the most part since most of this spring market is because in 2021, prices were actually pretty flat from, I'd say, January to August. I'm going to chat about that in our last section. So prices weren't moving very much. So even though prices were plummeting, 400,000, average prices were still up year over year in July, even though they were down significantly from the peak. Now we're getting into the period where prices are starting to be down year over year. And that's because in 2021, it's really in September and October that prices really started to accelerate again. So they were flat for most of 2021 up until about August. and then they really started to shoot up in September, October, and then peaking in February of 2021. So low-rise houses are now down about 9% over last year. Condos are, I think, up 1% over last year. So they're not down quite yet year over year.
And John, we're getting some questions from Baltaj and Nepal about the period before COVID. So can we compare what's going on now to 2020, because that's before the COVID, rocketing of prices started?
I mean, I don't know what, comparing it to what extent. I'm going to actually kind of talk about the prices.
Yeah, the price activity, I believe.
Well, yes. Prices are still, generally up pre-COVID. I mean, we're only down 9% year over year, right? So we're generally still up pre-COVID. I mean, if I zoom back on my charts here, if we look at sort of the condo prices, we are still well above, if we're looking at condominiums, for example, in early 2020, condo prices were in the low 600s, and now we're in the mid 700s. If I look back at house prices, low-rise home prices, at the beginning of 2020, we were right around 1 million was kind of roughly the price range for the average price for low-rise homes. And we're at 1.3 today. So we're still well above pre-COVID prices. If that's kind of the question that we're looking at, we're still quite above that.
Great. And I know you're going to be getting into a very interesting piece on how that data changed with sentiment during COVID. We've had a little bit of a discussion here around mortgages. I know there's a lot of concern in the media about people starting to struggle with mortgage rates. Yeah. I think there's a question here that's maybe a bit too specific about the average amount of mortgage being held by detached homeowners in the GTA. That's probably a bit too specific. That's something we might be able to look into. I think Gavin was able to pull some real stats about new mortgages, but I'm not sure that covers all new and outstanding.
Is the question about like the amount of mortgage? It's very hard.
Yeah, it's the average amount held by homeowners. Now, the questioner is asking specifically detached, but I'm not sure.
I don't know that. Yeah, that's very specific. I mean, I'll say that people would be surprised how many Canadians actually have no mortgage. It's quite significant. I think it's around 40, maybe even more percent of households don't have a mortgage. And of course, of the ones that do, most of them have had them for some time. It's the ones who probably got their mortgages over the past year, so they're the most impacted because, they took them out at these record low interest rates, so they might feel some of that payment shock. But again, even households who took out mortgages 5 years ago, if you're renewing right now, your mortgage is probably going to go from 3.5% to 5% or 5.5%. So even households that have owned for quite a few years are gonna see a bit of a payment shock. All right, if that is everything, we're going to chat a little bit about the pre-con condo market. In last month's kind of market update, I chatted about how this is kind of one of the segments where we might see some distress, and specifically, it's people who bought pre-construction condos years ago who now needs to take possession and are having a hard time getting a mortgage, right? And well, what is going on? And this article over the past month from the Star, I think really highlights kind of some of the stress that some of these investors have. And I'm just going to quote directly from the Star article because I think it's interesting. And it says here, Ujwal Jain never thought when he bought his pre-construction condo in April 2020 that it would cost him his life savings. As the date for him to take possession of the condo nears, the bank appraisal, which is done to ensure the current market value of a property is in line with the size of the mortgage loan, determined the unit is worth $150,000 less than what he agreed to pay for it 2 years ago, before shovels were in the ground. How am I, and this is him quoting, how am I supposed to close that transaction? Appraisals are coming in so low, people don't have $100,000 to $200,000. I've had friends who have had to declare bankruptcy, and I'm in the same boat. So, again, this is one of the big risks that, a lot of times agents don't tell you when you're buying pre-construction condos, but it's a highly speculative investment because If prices don't increase enough to justify what you paid for it, you're going to be in the same position as this investor here, where the condo he bought is worth less than what he paid for it. So he has to come up with a difference in that amount. And again, this is someone who bought in 2020, not, even 4 years ago. And even just yesterday, I believe it was, a agent online on Twitter who's very active in the pre-construction condo market tweeted this. He said, if you're looking for blood, I have some seriously distressed assignment sellers. Come take their units at 2018 prices, 15% under resale pricing. And that's Jordan Skrinko. So again, this is, of course, a sign. And what's really driving this is, and for some of these investors, there isn't so much that even that the price has declined. It could very well be the fact that they can't even get a mortgage on them. Again, if someone's selling a unit that they bought at 2018, I mean, in theory, the unit has gone up in value. Why are they selling it for below current resale prices? Because that market for assignments is dried up. So it sounds like they're basically selling them at the same price they bought them for 4 or 5 years ago. So again, we're starting to see this distress. And to what extent, I mean, I think the important question is going to be, to what extent does this spill over into, the housing market more broadly? Because virtually all of these investors most likely have homes and condos of their own that they live in, and if they need to come up with hundreds of thousands of dollars to close, or if they're defaulting on their purchases, how is that going to impact the market? And I think this is going to be a very important trend over the next 6 to 12 months, because from Urbanation, that's one of the prominent pre-construction condo market research firms, they said about 31,000 new condo completions are scheduled for next year, and 19,000 of those are in the first half. So, and that's a very, very high number, almost a record number for the GTA. So we have a lot of people that have condos scheduled for completion. And even if 10% of those have trouble closing, I mean, that's a lot of people that are going to be in a little bit of distress. So again, I think that's going to be one of the segments of the market that we're going to need to keep a close eye on, and to see to what extent that has an impact on the rest of the market. I don't know if we have any questions on that, Urmi, before I kind of go forward.
We're having a lot of great questions. Some are a bit more general, and not on this particular topic. So let's keep going, and we'll bring them in.
All right. So next, I'm going to chat about how Canada's immigration boom is to the home price rescue. So, I mean, obviously prices are kind of being pressured. At least they were in the spring. We're seeing some stability now. But, this is a quote from our Prime Minister talking about what's driving prices. And he said that one of the challenges we're facing in Canada is our population with immigration and other things has been growing over the past years, and housing construction hasn't kept up, which is a real problem. That's why one of the initiatives we're working on, $4 billion to municipalities in order to double the construction of new housing over the coming years. This is something that is going to help. Whether it's enough, we'll have to see. So again, I mean, we know that our population's booming faster than our ability to build homes. This of course, is putting pressure not just on house prices, but on rents, because a lot of people moving here need to rent housing, and rents are up 20% over last year. Now, when we think about, is supply going to double? I mean, this is what every government is telling us is going to happen. And our Prime Minister appears to be uncertain if that's going to happen, but we know it's not. I mean, at the end of the day, builders are already talking about that there are record low sales. Sales are plummeting significantly in the condominium market, down 79% over last year. Very few people are buying new housing properties right now, both condominiums and houses. And this is going to, of course, lead to a decline in the number of homes and condos being built over the next year or so. And again, one of the things that the Liberals announced is that they're going to be increasing immigration targets about 500,000 by 2025. And again, I think most market analysts see this as a way to support the housing market and support house prices and rents. And one prominent analyst, Ben Rabideau, kind of tweeted this around that time of the announcement. He said, a federal MP telling me via DM that high immigration supporting house prices was one of the key considerations in today's announcement. Shocked, I tell you, he says. So, I think one important thing, again, to take away from this is that, this immigration story, this lack of our industry ability to build houses is not going to change, I don't think, to any meaningful way, the dynamics we're going to see in the short term. Again, if we see pressure on condos because people can't get mortgages, if we see pressure in households who can't afford high pay, those challenges are going to overwhelm these longer term structural problems that are pushing house prices up. So, this is not a bull story over the next year or so. I mean, this to me just kind of suggests that I think we're going to continue to see pressure on, if it's not house prices, then it's going to be rents, because if people can't afford homes, that's fine, but then, people need to live somewhere. So if house prices aren't rising, we're going to continue to see rents. Again, once we're past this shock to our economy that we're all experiencing now due to these much higher both costs of goods and higher interest rates. So I think that's going to be, again, another important thing we're going to have to keep an eye on in the months ahead and years ahead.
Thanks, John. I know that this is something we're going to be digging into at Move Smartly. A question from Nepal touches upon something we're trying to get our minds around, which is, what are these government numbers actually about? So Nepal asks, how many of the immigrants are already here of the 1.2 projected to 2025? If they're here already, then they would already have some housing. Now, my understanding is the government often announces these targets. We then have to backtrack to how many have arrived of their targets. During COVID, in fact, a lot of the projected targets for the 2 years were not met. Yeah. So the question between who has actually arrived versus the targets, I think, is a complicated one. Any other comments on that?
Yeah, no, and 100% you're correct. And I think a lot of the numbers of new immigrants and permanent residents that have come over the past year are people that were already here, certainly. And I don't think this is all net new numbers, but this isn't new. I mean, even in the past, that was always the case. A lot of people, in some cases, students who were here for quite a few years eventually become permanent residents, new immigrants. So it's not necessarily all net new people, but certainly it's going to put pressure, because, again, these targets are quite a bit higher than we've seen in the past. So to some extent, it's good. If it's not going to put pressure on, like I said, on home prices, it's going to put pressure on our rental market. And again, I think the other important thing to keep in mind is that these are just targets. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't necessarily mean they will be hit and achieved. I think, certainly, maybe to some extent, high home prices, may make people consider looking elsewhere. I mean, we're already hearing it from our clients who are considering leaving Ontario because of high home prices. So, will the government achieve those goals? It's anyone's guess, but I think it's important to keep in mind that it's their target, at least.
And that is something, Nepal, we're going to be digging into, because some of these new government targets, if you looked at the details, there was a big increase in family reunification targets. Now, normally in those cases, many of those elderly parents joining families would live in the same household. So there is a lot of question marks around what the targets are. But I think John's major point, which is that the experts who've commented on these plans have noted that there is no real plan to plug the gap that is already existing with housing, and now that these targets are raising the numbers. So we're going to keep trying to dig into it at Move Smartly, but it's not that easy. Follow-up question from you, John, from Kevin on the issue of rents. Now, Kevin makes a comment that if rents keep rising, then the government will be forced to keep interest rates elevated. I think Kevin's alluding to something kind of interesting, which I'm not sure all of us realize, that rents are included as part of the consumer price index, which is one of the measures of inflation. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. And I was speaking with, let's just say, like, a policymaker, like through our one of our government agencies the other day, and this is certainly one of the things that they're worried about and they're thinking about. And what Urmi's talking about is, the CPI or our inflation index. Really, one of the components of that is housing. And when we think about housing, I mean, there's actually kind of one of those components is rental housing separate from owner occupied housing. So the faster rents are increasing, the more pressure that's going to put on that index. Now, one thing to keep in mind about that is that the majority of rents are not appreciating at the rate that they are like on the MLS. On the MLS, where we have, average condo rents and average house rents, and we say that they're up 20% year over year. This is on new units, right? Or on new transactions. Anyone who's living, for example, in a purpose-built apartment building that has been there for a year or two, their rent's only going up 2.5%, right? So certainly it's going to have some effect, and will likely, if rents keep surging, will certainly put pressure on the rental component of the CPI. But I don't know to what extent that is going to be the dominant issue, but certainly I think it's something we're going to have to keep an eye on and see what economists are saying about that.
Great. So many intertwined subjects. Maybe if we could return to the issue of mortgages, an interesting question coming up. I know this is more to do with our previous discussion in the previous section. You had the image there of Ujjal, I believe that was his name, getting into difficulty. There are a lot of anecdotes now about mortgage delinquency, or at least stress.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you think of that compared to the actual numbers on the ground of the and we have a question here about that, on the percentage of mortgages being delinquent, I believe already delinquent, not just stressed. Davin's been doing some great sleuthing on the fly here on the keyboard, finding one stat about less than 0.6% delinquency rate in Q2 in Toronto area. I know that there's a lot of qualifiers to those kind of numbers, but I'm just wondering what you think in general about the volume of delinquency and what we're seeing so far.
I mean, as far as I mean, I don't know specifically what the numbers are. They're quite low. Historically, they're always quite low in Canada. Like, people typically do not default on their homes. So I don't think that's going to be a massive story. My instinct is the ones who just can't afford it. I think the people are going to feel pressure, the ones with multiple properties, not so much the average household. I mean, I think the average household is just going to have to find a way to get by over the next year or so with these higher rates. But I think the ones that are feeling pressure, the ones maybe have multiple properties and have, mortgage payments going up on 2 or 3 properties. And, those households may just sell rather than just, default on their mortgage. But again, I don't think the numbers are quite high yet. I think the space to watch, and I've tweeted about it and we talked about it, certainly are going to be our borrowers who got mortgages from private lenders or from secondary lenders. Some of them are not renewing the mortgages. So, the homeowner basically has to find other financing or just sell and move out. But again, I don't think these are massive numbers yet. And I think this is going to be one of the unknowns, right? Like, when we think about what does the fall market look like, for things to get worse in the fall, it's not just that sales have to remain low, which they're already at a 20-year low. For prices to fall, we likely would need to see an increase in inventory, an increase in the number of listings. So if we see some distress from households, then that could lead to that. But again, I think it's still a bit early to say.
On that note, John, is it possible that there are specific sectors that we should be tracking first? For example, I think you've written recently, and you touched upon in this session earlier, the pre-construction condo sector. So wondering if assignments, people trying to get mortgages for properties they built a while ago, could be one first sign of an area of concern. And then to your other question, are there specific areas in the GTA where there's been a great expansion of people buying into even family homes as an investment?
That's a great question. And I mean, so for starters, the condo market certainly is a place to look. The challenge, though, is that it's not a very transparent market. The market for what we call assignment sales, so that's people who are trying to flip their pre-construction condo contract before they take ownership, is not transparent because they can't be advertised on the MLS. They can't be advertised publicly. The builders generally don't allow it. So they're just usually on, third-party websites and private Facebook or WhatsApp groups and things like that. So it's a segment that we don't have a lot of clarity on. I think research firms probably like Urbanation are going to be writing about it in the future. And you'll probably start to see more stuff on Twitter, quite frankly, that is anecdotal, kind of on the ground, not a public data source. So I think that's certainly one segment that we're going to keep an eye on. With respect to the investors and are there certain segments, again, I think that's very hard to tell, because what we've been finding recently is that many of the investors who invest, I'm going to say investors in quote, because they weren't that bought over the past year or two, weren't traditional investors who go out and buy homes that are listed for sale. Many of them were people who owned homes or condos, moved out of them, and just held them as an investment. So it's harder to track those. We have some data, but again, many of these people have a lot more equity than someone who bought at February 2022, those peak prices. And even among those, we still don't have a lot of data, because in the past, we still analyze the number of homes bought by investors and then rented on the MLS. But increasingly, a lot of people are buying these and renting them out to students, or effectively using them as rooming houses, because a lot of our growth in Ontario's population is from non-permanent residents, and a lot of those are foreign students, and the universities and colleges aren't building student housing, and these students, of course, need an affordable place to live. So, people are just converting homes to basically rooming houses and, renting out rooms for, $500-$600 a month. And those never make it on the MLS, so you can't track those. So it's very hard to say, which areas might see that, because again, some of this data is not information that we actually have available.
Thanks, John. A very important issue. We're going to keep tracking it. I know John's always in touch with these. We're also at Move Smartly going to be doing some expert interviews, other experts, to try and dig into some of these stories that we're only seeing in the news as anecdotes, but to see if there are any numbers we can get behind, whether there are certain regions in the GTA or segments that might see early delinquency or other problems. Thanks, John. I think the rest of the questions are now a bit more general, so we'll return to them after this next segment.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up by chatting a little bit about the sentiment on the ground and how it's changed during COVID. So, right now, let me rewind. If we go look back in the spring market when prices started declining, the sentiment was very pessimistic. Right now, it's not overly pessimistic. I think buyers are cautious, but they're having a hard time finding a home. So what I want to chat a little bit about right now is specifically what I mean by sentiment. And sentiment is one of these hard things to measure. It's hard things to describe. And I think it's going to be helpful to kind of walk through some of the dynamics we saw in the housing market, because if we look at Toronto's housing market, even since 2019, if we look at some of the basic trends, and the ones I'll look at are the months of inventory, again, which is something I talked about, which is the relationship between the number of homes for sale divided by the number of homes that actually sold, and price changes. I think it's going to help tell us a little bit of a story about these massive changes in mood and sentiment among buyers. This is when buyers get overly excited. They have the fear of missing out, will pay anything for homes. And then at some point they can go from that to more cautious. And then all of a sudden panicked and fearful, and listings are surging and prices are falling. So when we think about it, it's a lot like thinking about like the speedometer and the speed of the car. When the market is accelerating and kind of almost redlining to this max, this is kind of when we are hitting this fear of missing out, this exuberance period in the market. And then when we're slamming on the brakes is when we're kind of hitting this fear cycle in the market. And when we're right in the middle and we're kind of in cruise control, there's not much going on. And you can be at cruise control at 100 kilometers per hour or at 60 kilometers per hour. But the point is things are steady. Nothing dramatic is changing, right? So if we go back in time and look at sort of what happened since I'll say 2019 is what I'm going to be looking at. The GTA basically saw the number of homes available for sale, the months of inventory decline from 3 months to actually right around 1 month of inventory within the span of 12 months. So the market accelerated, and it was at 3 months of inventory because the market was very slow in 2018. The market had just crashed the year earlier in the suburbs. We had a stress test introduced in January 1st, 2018. So the market was adjusting to these dynamics. It was very slow. We had 3 months of inventory, which is a sluggish market, but things really accelerated in 2019 as we were moving into the start of 2020. And what happened with prices is that they also accelerated from around, mid 700s on average to about 900,000 within a year. Prices, I think, were up around 17% year over year in February. And if we had not had COVID, it would have felt like we would have hit sort of this exuberance period where things were going nuts. But what happened literally overnight is we had the lockdowns, and then the market just saw a big spike in listings. Prices actually declined because there was a lot of fear in the market at the time. If we look back, 2 years ago, or more than 2 years ago, there's a lot of uncertainty in March and April of 2020. No one knew what was going on. It wasn't clear. People were worried that we're going to, hit a Great Depression. And then, once we got out of that, the market kind of hit cruise control. Inventory levels were pretty stable. Prices were pretty stable, till about the fall of 2020. And then literally overnight, what happened was the market skyrocketed. We saw inventory levels plummet. So we went from, about just over 1.5 months of inventory to like 0.7. So inventory plummeted, and then all of a sudden prices spiked from like low 900s to over 1.1 million, literally overnight, like a couple $100,000 in the span of 2 or 3 months. And that was the first sort of period of exuberance, this sort of end of 2020 to the beginning of 2021, where prices exploded. And if you've been with us the whole call, you'll recall I mentioned earlier that for a lot of 2021, prices were flat. Inventory was flat and prices were flat. They dipped a little bit in the summer of 2021. I think that was partly because more condos sold, but for the most part, prices were relatively flat for most of 2021. Inventory didn't change very much. And what was interesting about this period in 2021, it's not just that it was balanced. Homes were actually taking longer to sell. We had clients who just were not getting bidding wars all of a sudden. We had clients who were making homes conditional on financing and home inspection. I mean, that was impossible in the first 2 months of 2021 when things were unbelievably hot. And all of a sudden, we had this very calm market where it's kind of like now, the nicest homes still had bidding wars, but everything else was just sitting in the market for a little bit longer, and you can make offers conditional on financing and home inspection. So again, we had this mood of just balance and calm. And again, what was really, I think the one thing that was really unexpected and people weren't really prepared for was this second explosion in demand and in prices. And in the second half of 2021, basically a year ago, inventory levels plummeted again from an already low 1 month of inventory to half a month of inventory. And again, prices skyrocketed within 2 months. Prices were up roughly about a couple 100,000, I think, in 2 months. And they peaked just over 1.3 million. And that peak was in February 22. So we went from, again, a steady market and for most of 2021 to this exuberance in the first, a second half of 2021, first 2 months of this year. And then, things hit this fear phase, which is fascinating. And we can kind of, if we look at inventory levels exploded from under 1 month to over 3 months of inventory, from over, 1.3 million average price to around 1.1. basically overnight. And, what causes these massive shifts? And these are all shifts in sentiment. Again, there's no macro. I mean, aside from the fact that the Bank of Canada talked about raising rates in early 2020 or 2022 this year. Again, this is just buyers pulling out of the market. We hadn't felt the impact of rates yet when prices were falling. This is buyers just getting very cautious. And then, after we hit this massive decline in prices, really since the summer, I'd say, is when, again, the sentiment had shifted again. In the spring, everyone was trying to get a better deal. Everyone was just, every buyer at least was trying to get a better deal. Every seller was panicked and was eager to sell. They were worried prices would be lower tomorrow. And now that sentiment has reversed a little bit. I mean, sellers are patient. Buyers, I don't think buyers feel like they're getting deals now because they see that prices have plateaued. I'd say that the buyers are, like I said earlier on, are still, I think most of the buyers we talk to realize that prices could very well dip next year. I don't think they're panicked about prices over the long term. But most of them just want a home and they can't find one. So their sentiment isn't, I'm going to get out of the market because prices might fall. I think some of them are patient and waiting for the right home. But the mood right now isn't pessimistic, I'd say. I mean, it's cautious. Sellers, in fact, are probably a little bit confident. And in some cases are renting their homes if they can't sell them. But again, this is short term. I mean, what I'm talking about right now are the dynamics today, and this could easily shift as we move into the new year. And again, news of job losses, recessions, especially if they start accelerating, again, or distressed sales, could also shift sort of that dynamic as we move into the new year. But right now, if you're looking for a home, it would be hard to call the mood fearful or pessimistic. I think buyers are cautious. I think sellers are somewhat optimistic. Some of them are struggling if they don't have that most beautiful home and they aren't getting showing. So certainly some sellers are feeling sort of this decline in demand and the fact that buyers are more patient. But again, it's an interesting sentiment. It's not what I expected, this sort of plateauing that we hit right now. But again, some of these dynamics and how buyers and sellers are going to react is unpredictable. So that's a little bit about sort of the thing that I've been seeing in the ground.
John, keeping us there, this chart's inspired a lot of great comments and discussion. I think it's worth taking a moment here. So Tom and Kevin raised a great point about rents. Rents are interesting because it's not quite a macro factor. It's a short-term reaction. Now, we know that during the COVID period, when rents plummeted, especially in the downtown Toronto area, as everyone went back to stay with relatives or as everybody was working from home, rents fell off a cliff. In fact, landlords were having to negotiate reductions for their tenants. And in many cases, it seems like a lot of condo sellers may have panicked in that moment. So can you talk about, John and Kevin make the point that seeing rents activity over this graph would be interesting. And I wonder if you can comment on how much of numbers like that, which may have been short term, play into some of the sentiment then.
It's a great question. So, and this chart, the one that I'm speaking about and the one we're looking at is mainly focused on the entire market. It's not on condos. If I had focused on just the condo market, the segment between the spring of 2020 and November 2020 would look very different if I just focused on condominiums. So the big difference for condos was that inventory actually spiked significantly. So a lot of and when I looked at the data, a lot of the people who were listing condos for sale were investors, or a disproportionate number. Condo prices actually started falling during that period. Rents started declining, and definitely investors panicked. They saw people leaving the city. They saw tenants demanding price reductions, rent reductions. Some tenants weren't paying the rent, and they panicked. And what happened was, and what is interesting again, and these things are so hard to predict, like the November 2020 acceleration and the rapid decline in inventory was largely investors jumping in again, seeing some value because prices had dipped, whatever it is, 10 or 15%, and jumping back in the market. Again, even though rents were low and the sentiment was still pessimistic in the news, the mood of the investors was optimistic. They're like, I don't care if people want price reductions in the rents now. I'm buying for the long term. Prices are down. I think this is a deal. And literally, this is why inventory levels for condos plummeted from November of 2020 to the first few months of 2021, because investors jump in and basically bought up all that inventory. And it took some while for rents to recover, but the investors who bought then, they didn't care that rents were low. Again, they were buying for the longer term, and they were optimistic that rents would increase in the future anyway. So it is an interesting story. If we looked at just condos, the chart would look, I think the narrative would be very, very different. It would be more exaggerated, especially during 2020.
Great. Oh, sorry, John, have we lost your audio?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, but it's cutting out a bit.
Okay.
Sorry, and so I think you're finished your comment there. I think we're at our time, so it might be good to end with some quick hits. We had a lot of great discussion, and I want to reassure everybody that a lot of the topics being asked, whether the government's building the right kind of housing for the immigration targets coming, things around future sentiments will be covered in John's monthly reports and even on our channels at Move Smartly on YouTube and Twitter. I thought we could just do some quick fire questions. John, if you're still there.
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, so let's go quick fire. You've already mentioned home sellers in previous reports. You said they're sitting on the sidelines. They have the option to rent out or hold on. Any sign of whether they will come back? Some comments were about this spring, maybe earlier.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we should see more inventory come out in the spring. I mean, anecdotally, like some of the sellers who are taking their homes off the market are optimistic that things will be better in the spring. We're not obviously telling them that because most of our advice stems from what most experts say in terms of forecasting. We don't do forecasts. I mean, experts are arguing that things, if anything, will get worse next year, not better. The best case is prices plateau, but the homeowners are more optimistic, right? So some of them certainly are taking their homes off the market, thinking that they're just going to list in the spring and the market will be better, right? And I'm not going to, who knows? I mean, I didn't predict that we'd have a COVID housing boom, so it's impossible to predict. But I think we will see more inventory as we move into the new year. But again, I don't think it's going to be a flood of listings. That's the point. Like I think we'd have to see a massive surge in inventory to see pressure on prices, but we'll see.
Great. And quick cue, we're likely to see interest rates elevated for a while.
Yeah.
Great.
Got a question? Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think certainly, I mean, I don't think there's any discussion that they're going to decline. I mean, I think some economists I've looked at said we might see cuts end of next year. But I think, we talked about this, I think, on our roundtable with Steve. I mean, those aren't bullish narratives. I mean, if rates get cut end of next year, they're cutting gradually, like 25 basis points or 50 basis points, and they're doing it because we're in a recession, right? So I think we're going to still have very elevated rates or interest rates for some time. We may see 5-year rates decline over the next year. Again, if economically and the mood becomes more pessimistic, because 5-year rates are driven by the bond market, not based on what the Bank of Canada is doing. So we may see 5-year rates drop next year, but again, I think we're still going to have elevated rates for some time.
Okay, some quick fires about value in the market. So are houses more likely to hold their value because they are older and don't have as high prices because of what sellers bought for? Or do other factors figure, like condition or the location of the property?
So when they say houses versus condos, or?
I think this is a general question. I'm going to just say, actually, let's say, do you expect, the first last asks, do you expect prices of older homes to decline more than the prices of newer homes? So let's stick with homes and assume it means, a single family home.
I actually don't know. I don't think it's about age. Like I think personally, downtown Toronto has very, very old homes, 100+ years old. And we're finding that the market down here is actually holding up relatively well right now. It's relatively busy. Part of that is just that downtown Toronto didn't appreciate as much as many of the suburbs. I mean, downtown Toronto might be closer to pre-COVID levels or slightly above that, whereas the outer suburbs are still way above pre-COVID levels, right? So going forward from now over the next year or two, I don't know if it's about age. I think it's about probably partly about geography. And I think the areas that probably are going to get hammered the most are probably the ones that are the furthest out from the GTA, I'd say. Like these kind of more rural townships that exploded during the boom that normally don't get bidding wars, and all of a sudden they had 15 offers on every home. It is my instinct again, but this is just a guess. I mean, it's impossible to predict.
Great. And is the question, if this is a follow-up, is new construction innately more expensive because it was more expensive to build? I know you've written on the fact that it's not just these short-term numbers. A lot of it is about expectations and how much exuberance there was in the market around some of these newer homes.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, if you look at, I mean, this is a complicated question to go, what's driving the price of pre-construction properties? I mean, because it's a ton of factors, including construction costs, land prices, which have exploded. And this is partly why pre-construction units are more than resale units. The other factor is that we have a lot of exuberance and investors are willing to pay it. Like if investors weren't willing to pay certain elevated prices, developers wouldn't be prepared to pay the prices they're paying for the land that they're buying, right? Because when they're buying land, they're expecting certain prices on their projects. And if investors weren't paying that, land wouldn't be selling what it's selling for. So I think it's a whole, I mean, everything is interconnected effectively.
We're having a lot of great discussion and banter here now on the thread. I think our time's up. I do want to respect that many are joining us during their lunch hour. There's a few more quick hits. I want to reassure there are questions around whether the government is building the right type of housing. I already mentioned this, Misha. This is something we're going to dig into. I think the short answer is no, they're not building the right stuff.
It's not
for what's coming in.
It's not even the government. I mean, again, a lot of our new construction's being driven by who's buying the homes, and it's disproportionately investors, which is why our condos are quite tiny. We're not building a lot of family-sized housing, which a lot of people are making. I mean, it's not just us or you and I making this argument. We know this. And there are ways to do this that we're not doing now. Certainly encouraging more density in existing neighborhoods, but we're not doing all of those things. And this is why I think one of the reasons why the market's a little bit broken. We're not building homes for families very much. We're building a lot of small condos, and not to say we don't need those, because obviously we need sort of whatever inventory and supply we can get. But I think one of the challenges is certainly there aren't a lot of options for family homes, whether that is in condos or condo townhomes or whatever that might be. But we're not building a lot of that in terms of new housing stock.
And that leads me nicely to wrap up on, to reassure everyone, Adriano, you're asking about whether the Ontario Build Homes Faster Act will help. We are going to be doing some deeper dives into some of this messaging. I'm going to be talking to expert Dr. Moffat on what these plans might do. There are some accelerated targets around density and maybe even pushing municipalities to do that more. We're going to see whether these words can be matched with actual action on the ground. And I know, John, you're going to be talking soon to condo experts about housing starts and how having them fall off during periods of uncertainty, then it feeds back into price acceleration once everybody starts wanting to rush back into the markets.
Exactly.
So stay tuned to our Move Smartly channel, both here on YouTube and on Twitter, where you can find these expert interviews and other content. And if you have any issues that you want to talk about with more detail, John and I have started a really interesting feature called The Situation, where we talk about 3 to 4 specific situations that homeowners, renters, buyers, sellers find themselves in the GTA.
If you have a situation like that, please email us at askjohn@mooserently.com and join us for that session.
Awesome,
Thanks,
everybody.
John.
Thanks everyone for joining today, and we'll see you all next month.
Great. Thanks, Davin, on the keyboarding sleuth as well, and all of you for your questions. Talk to you soon.